everyone, and welcome to episode 235 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danièle Cybulskie, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. It's a body part. It's a musical. It's a vehicle for self-expression. And weirdly, it's often a political statement. I'm talking about hair. For something as ordinary and innocuous as the bits of fluff growing out of our skin, medieval people, and modern people for that matter, sure have a lot of thoughts about hair. Before we begin today, take a moment to think back to all the different hairstyles that you've seen in the last few days and what you thought when you saw them. Because it's time to dive into the naughty world where hair meets politics. This week, I'm happy to welcome back to the podcast Dr. Emanuele Lugli to talk about hair in 15th century Florence. Emanuele is assistant professor of art history at Stanford University, and you may remember him as the guy who made measurement cool from our chat a few years back about his book, The Making of Measure and the Promise of Sameness. His new book is Knots, or the Violence of Desire in Renaissance Florence. Our conversation on how hair was used as a form of control, how it spilled out onto artists' canvases, and what this all has to do with bodily excrement is coming up right after this. Well, thank you so much for joining me again, this time to talk about hair. It is a pleasure to see you again, so thanks for coming on.
Thank you, Danièle, for having me. It's a pleasure.
It's so good to see you. So, okay, talking about hair, your book is very specific to a time and place. Can you tell me why you've got this in this specific time and place and where and when we're talking about?
Sure. So Knots, this book, it's a cultural history of hair in late 15th century Florence. But while I was doing research, trying to understand how people dealt with hair at the time, I realized that a lot of the beliefs and tenets and concepts and ideas swirling around hair were actually much older, like they were ancient, but they were especially important in the Middle Ages. So much so that from a hair perspective, the Renaissance does not exist. It's no different than, let's say, the 12th or the 13th century. So they're going to be thinking about, okay, how I'm going to deal with these issues of time, how I'm going to approach it. And then I decided, you know what? I'm actually going to take a very, very small period of time. Actually, the period that goes from 1469 to 1492, which corresponds to the time where Lorenzo il Magnifico was ruler of Florence. And I'm just going to read everything that was published and produced within that bracket. And that's going to be like my starting and end points. This way, I'll be able to recreate how people talked about hair. And if the ideas were medieval, I'm going to flag them up. If the ideas were like much older, I'll do so. And that for me is interesting because it shows, you know, when we're writing about history, we're not writing about ideas that exist only in that bubble. But we're also talking about these legacies, these traditions, and so much that our chronological boundaries are not so much important for the people at the time. So for me, playing with temporality was very important. There's also another reason. A lot of the book is about the work of painters such as Sandro Botticelli, Leonardo da Vinci, big names. But the chronologies of these works are very debated. So we actually don't know exactly when they were made. And I was like, you know what? Why don't I take this as an opportunity for writing history in a different way? Why don't I become a little bit more relaxed about this kind of chronological pinpoints? And I start writing in a sort of chronological blur. And it was effective. It really helped me to shed some of the anxieties I had about historical narratives.
That's so true. I think the idea of a chronological blur is so helpful, and many of us should probably adopt that when we start to think about things like ideas of hair, because as I was reading it, of course, I noticed that many of the ideas of hair that people had back in the day, they still have now. And I mean, for people who have never seen a picture of me, like I have very short hair, and as soon as I cut it, I was still a teenager and I've just kept it short ever since. I did it because I was vain. I thought it would look good with my cheekbones. And the way people started to read me has been different ever since. And so reading this in that sort of temporal blur, I think is a great idea as a way of approaching something that is so universal. Everybody has hair somewhere. So yeah, it works.
Yeah, precisely. And this is some of the questions in the book. Hair is obviously universal. And also we know of it as universal. And therefore, we think that it provides sort of a trait d'union, this kind of link with other cultures, with people from different periods. And while I wanted to stress the point, I also wanted to try to find out what is specific about Florentines' approach to hair in the late 15th century. What makes it distinctive? And that helped me to reflect about my own universal tendencies when writing history, wanted to make everything I write valid for everyone, and learn when I should stop. Learn when maybe I should say that some of these points are valid for only these people. And, so for me, that became very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so when we're talking about hair and we're talking about Florence, we're going to get to Florence. What were people thinking of hair in terms of medicine? So when we think about the anatomy of people, what were they thinking that hair was? What was it?
Yeah, thank you. Actually, that was what got me excited at the beginning of my research. I started looking at how physicians, doctors, natural philosophers, who are the ancestors of what today we call scientists, thought about hair. And they had very interesting ideas about hair. Well, first of all, as us, they thought that hair was dead. And yet, this represented an enigma because hair kept growing, even on corpses. And so, even after people died. And so, they were trying to understand how is it possible that this thing is dead and yet keep growing? How do we explain that from a physical point of view? So, that was very interesting. But also, they tried to explain many other things, why people become bald, why women are never bald, why women's hair seem to be longer than men. And therefore, they start finding reasons, natural reasons, for beliefs that today we regard as cultural rather than biological. And that for me was the very interesting things. I was like, oh, wait a second. So hair is not so much an object, but it's actually a venue. It's a place where people craft ideas about the world that may have nothing to do with nature, and yet they're presented as natural.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what it got me into hair. I was like, oh, wait a second, this is why hair becomes so important, and that's why there's so much hair talk at the time, because actually hair is telling you a lot of things about genders, about how you should behave, what it means to be a good Christian. These are all ideas that hair helps to reinforce.
Mm-hmm. And it comes together in strange ways, and it's both very important and not important at the same time. And I think from the medical point of view, people were thinking it's just excrement, right? It's just extra stuff that just grows out of the head. Just like you eliminate anything else, you're eliminating your digestion through your head, right?
Totally. Yes. Thank you actually for pointing that out. Is hair was thought as excrement, like tears, like mucus, like nails. So its digestive surfeit is like it's something that is superfluous, is that what your body has not digested, it turns into this viscous smoke inside your body. And if you consider your body as a chimney, this viscous smoke keeps going up until it hits the body's radiator, that is the brain, and then the brain kind of fans this kind of smoke away. But what is left is this kind of matter that accumulates just under the scalp and keeps pushing. And that's how hair gets formed. It's basically a filament of superfluities, of what is left from the digestive process that comes out from your scalp, from your chin, from your armpits, the same way the sweats and tears come out from other conduits. So that's what hair is, right? It's really excrement. And a lot of people made a big deal out of this, especially preachers. They take this kind of scientific fact as a way to chastise everyone who is vain about her hair, or or women in general, because women have longer hair because they're forced to, but still.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's just nature. That's just how it is. Okay, so now we're talking about preachers, and this is a good point to start explaining. What was the church's take on hair? Was it the same for men and women?
Absolutely not, as you can imagine. Because hair was considered superfluous, it was considered a sort of like abomination. And therefore, hair had to be cut short if you were a man, even shaven in the case of nuns. And it was considered to be synonyms with vice, mistakes, errors, desire, everything that revolves around vices, especially the vice of lust. Hair was considered to be the catalyst of desire. Seeing a woman's curl, like a wisp of hair coming out of a woman's veil, was considered incredibly erotic. And they made a big deal out of this. And so hair becomes a sort of a culprit, the reasons, the trigger for any vice. And that, of course, means that women get demonized as well, because they're often identified as hairy creatures, creatures where hair naturally blooms and flourishes. And hair does not just grow on women's head, it expresses itself.
It's interesting because it lives in two different places in that you have men, for example, were supposed to be super rational and they get rid of their hair if they need to think about things. So like a monk might get rid of his hair or comb it out because he has to make space for him to have deep thoughts. But at the same time, I think you said in the book that baldness means you're way too lusty. So it's like, how does this work?
The texts are full of contradictions. And it's because they try to make sense of the real, which of course doesn't have any rule or any logic behind. So many physicians, many doctors came up with different explanations for what they saw. So the texts are not exactly rational in the way we expect scientists to be today. But within even the messiness of the sources, there are some interesting points. For instance, women's hair was called differently than men's hair. So men's hair is called capillis in Latin, whereas women's hair is called crines. And surprise, surprise, even animal fur is called crines. So already at the linguistic level, women and animals are put on the same plane. So there is that. Second, a lot of how hair behaves was explained through the humoral theory that I'm sure, as you know, and your listeners certainly know, it depends on the four humors that regulate the well-being of a body. Women were considered to be moister, colder, and then somehow was the perfect environment for hair. Somehow the viscous smoke I was telling you about retained its greasiness because of this environment, and therefore hair could grow longer because it was stickier, was more viscous. Men were more energetic, stronger, and therefore hotter and drier, did not retain this internal viscousness. And therefore, the hair was considered to be shorter or it was prone to falling. But then, physicians also thought about all the different circumstances in which a body can be heated up. And sex is one of them. So making love, having sex, produces frictions that increases heat. And therefore, that can mean that in women who are naturally cold, increases the growth of hair. And that's, for instance, how they explain pubic hair. It's the result of frictions. And there are terrible cases like women have been accused of having sex just because they had pubic hair, right? And at the same time, for men who are naturally hot, extreme lust and sex leads to hair falling off their head. So they're classified as erotomaniacs.
It's funny, and at the same time, it's not funny because it is so heavily policed, especially in this time and place. So tell us some of the rules that people needed to follow when it came to hair, because they couldn't just walk around with their hair however they wanted. What were some of the rules people needed to follow in this time and place?
Oh, there were so many. Like it's actually a little bit insane. We go from a philosopher saying that you have to comb your hair 40 times in the morning, the moment you wake up. The first thing you do in the day is to take your ivory comb and comb it 40 times as a way to expurgate yourself, to women who, the moment they marry, they have to start wearing the veil and make sure that it kind of adheres perfectly to your scalp. So not a curl is being seen. And we also know how women, even before marriage, they have to braid their hair into this very long braid that then circle around their head, and they compact it there. And there are many ways to do so. But one of the things I say is that this policing of the hair that we usually consider as a form of care is really a way to understand the politics of the time, how men and especially women were forced to polish their own body as a way to align it to the political diktats of the time. So we think as politics as something external that is coming from, the city hall, the church, and enter private spheres. But hair care is also one of these moments where you start policing your body and making those external regulations part of your private and inner life.
Yes, because people were looking at you on the street or off the street, and they were automatically making a judgment about who you are, where you are in the social hierarchy, and what your morals are, right?
Exactly, exactly. There's a lot that people inferred from the way one styled their hair. And so you immediately understand things such as class. Aristocratic women allow themselves certain privileges that regular women did not have. They could wear brooches, pearls, for instance, whereas other women did not. You immediately understand what kind of stage in your life you were, whether you were married or not, whether you were a virgin or not. You understood if you were a soldier, a priest, or just a young boy. In a way, hair, and many scholars have written about this, but like hair, it's is a social marker and is a main form of communications between people who sometimes don't exchange a word. And so hair is this kind of social means of communication.
One of the things that jumped out at me in terms of this particular context of being Florence in late 15th century was that people were obsessed with order. So the way that you styled your hair, it had to be perfect and it had to kind of represent the values of the community, which were that we need to have order. And I think one of the things you mentioned as well is that even the center part that Jesus has in a lot of the images was meant to represent order, which I had never come across before. So tell us what the obsession with order was in this particular time and place.
Yes, thank you. And this is such a nice way to put it. Order is the operative word of hairstyling in the Renaissance, but also in the Middle Ages. You find it in all sorts of regulations. You find it in text to educate boys and girls. You find it in sermons of preachers. And many scholars have pointed that out. But that's where I differ from many historians. They simply say that, combing your hair is a way to produce order. And technically, the comb is this ordering tool. A medieval and a Renaissance comb is made of two parts. You have a row of teeth that is extremely fine, where the teeth are next to each other, and that's used for cleaning. So you remove all the debris and the things that got stuck in your hair. And then you have another row, which is wider, and that helps for combing, or perhaps you dip the comb in perfumed oil, and that you use that as a way to make your hair more attractive. But this tool, which is a tool of order, the point I want to make is that order is not a neutral word. It's not just something that you do and everyone is content with it. It's precisely the way through which the political mindset enters your private sphere. The fact that all these books on cosmetics and so on tell you that you have to order your hair is a way to tell you you have to behave like a good citizen. You have to meet the expectations of your fellow citizens. And usually these fellow citizens are boni homines, people of good standing that also have political roles. So what they're actually saying is that through the comb, your little ivory tool, you actually contribute to the social order that the government is deciding. And that's where my work differs from that of other historians. For instance, I refuse at some point to use the word order in the book, because I think by doing so, we continue perpetrating this sort of violent idea that women's bodies need to be regulated and a bunch of men usually decides what to do with them. And so I was like, we have to realize, we have to read between the lines. We have to realize when some of the sources are being prescriptive and, in my own words, violent. And so the book, in fact, is about hair care, but it's also about history writing. What kind of words and ideas should we use when writing history? How can we write a history that is attentive to the discrepancies and the violences of the past, and at the same time does not repeat them absent-mindedly?
I think that was a great strength of the book. And you have this right up front at the beginning, and you're even questioning like how you come at it as a historian. I'm asking you to believe me instead of other people. And so really kind of deconstructing what concepts people are taking for granted or which ones we're reading back on the past without interrogating. And I think the one about care, which is I think on like page 2 or 3, you talk about care being a tool of violence in a lot of ways, and that it might be under the guise of care, people saying, I'm giving you this advice so that you can make it in the city, but is also, I'm giving you this advice because it makes my life easier, right?
Precisely, precisely. Yes, I put it right at the front because that's one of the main points of the book. And some colleagues and historians came to me and said, Emanuele, I thought that page was very difficult to read because I could see myself in it. I was like, look, I completely understand it. I mean, it was, I wrote it mostly for myself because I realized my own delusions as a historian. I realized my own problems when writing history. I tell people how they should be looking at these facts and how they should interpret the past. But let's be honest, this is just my own, sometimes forced way of looking at the past. And I want to stop doing that. So how can I do that? I was like, maybe I have to drop the patronizing tone. 2, the book is half text and half sources. And I had to fight a little bit with the publisher because they wanted to cut all the original text. And I was like, no, we need them. We need them because I want people to actually look at the sources by themselves and realize whether my translation is accurate and whether perhaps they have a different way of interpreting it. We have to give people the choice to see the sources. And the publisher was like, well, people, if they're that interested, they can actually look at the sources themselves. And I was like, they won't. Some of these texts are very difficult to find unless you have access to university libraries, and especially some university libraries, you'll never see them. And also, a lot of this work is on primary sources. It's not on edited modern editions of text. And there's no way that these people are going to go to Florentine libraries and read the manuscripts themselves. So I think it's part of my job to do this work of transcriptions for them. So I was like, please, let's put them in. It's important. It's part of the politics of the book. We have to give people a choice. We have to make them realize that even if I did my best to write a history book that is engaging and addresses multiple issues and works on many levels, at the same time, they still need to be given the choice to see if what I wrote is correct according to their viewpoints or not. And so I was adamant about this, and I'm glad that eventually they went with me. But that means that the book is basically 50% text and 50% sources, which is fine by me. But this is also a way that I was trying to go against the idea that the historian is the one that you have to trust 100%. So much of history writing is about not so much convincing, but earning the trust of the reader. And besides earning the trust of the reader, I also want to put the reader in a position of power, of like deciding for themselves.
I think that's really important, that transparency. And as I was reading it, I was thinking this is a real shift in the way more and more historians are starting to write in a way that's transparent and saying, here's my work, showing their work. You can look at it and decide for yourself. But I think that this particular book really spells it out very well. And so for people who are trying to picture it, in the back of the book, you have all of the sources in their original language. So you can look at that. So that's becoming increasingly valuable, I think, as historians, where you want to look at the original language and see it. Was there a transcription error? Was there a translation error? And coming to it a bit more fresh so that you can make those decisions for yourself. But there it is. You're pushing against order at the same time as writing about it.
Yes, yes, indeed. I mean, that's really the main point of the book. If we think that care means caring in one specific way, according to rules that sometimes are not fully spelled out, technically, the form of caring is a form of violence. And sure, violence is always a component of life because people have opinions and some people express them more forcefully than others. But the point is also that doesn't mean that history writing has to conform to this form of thinking. Maybe there are alternative ways of doing history where we can be a bit lighter, a bit more transparent, and take the readers also for the intelligent being than they are, and not for school children that need to be told what happened in the past. But you can just provide them the tools and say, look, this is my quandary. I don't know what to deal with those dates. This evidence makes no sense, but this is the way I approach it. And hopefully this is going to be generative for other people.
I think that one of the ways this book works well in achieving those goals is by putting art at the center. So you mentioned that Botticelli is a huge part of this book and the way you explore it. And so for people who don't know Botticelli by name, if you've seen the painting of Venus where she has reddish gold hair and it's flying everywhere, she's on her seashell and she's just barely covered up, that is Botticelli's Venus. And this is really at the heart of the book. So why did you pick this particular painting as a way of exploring hair?
Yes, I find that after reading about hair care in educational books, in the poetry of the time, in the scientific treatises, in preacher sermons, that specific painting stood out to me as unbelievably bold. I was like, this is not just the painting of a nude. This is a painting of this animated, extremely long mane that must have made men literally faint when they saw it, because it's the opposite of everything that is being written down. And so I was like, let me look more carefully into this artist because I think he's doing something exceptional, like bold, strange, confusing. And when you look at Botticelli's productions, you realize that he was indeed a bold artist. It took many gambles. He made a lot of paintings that went directly against some of the normatives we just discussed. And I was trying to understand why. I was like, is there like a political class of people that protect him? And a lot of it is something to do with joy, also with beauty. The idea that beauty, joy, and art perhaps flourish outside of this normative. Is someone that seems to have understood that. At the same time, his career arc proves that his voice was weaker because eventually he stops painting these alluring manes and wonderful women and becomes very normative as well, which also gives you a sense of the disproportionate power of certain voices versus his attempts.
It's so true that the hair is the thing that really stands out in that painting still today. I think that's the part that your eye is drawn to. And for Italians who are, walking around the peninsula, they're seeing nude statues all over the place. The nudeness is not the part that is scandalous to an artist looking at something, but the hair is just out of control. And it's such an important piece, I think, as you're mentioning, because in all sorts of sermons, it's the hair that is drawing men in and it's irresistible and they cannot control themselves if they see even a little bit of hair. So you're right. Like when you look at Botticelli's Venus, it's the hair that is speaking volumes about the fact that it's Venus that we're looking at.
Yes. And I think there's we have also to remember that hair at the time had a demonic overtone. The reason why hair is so irresistible is that the main hairy creature is the devil, and the devil ends up embodying people's fantasies. You know, everything that hair stands for: vice, corruption, lust, irrationality, and disorder. And that's why women's hair in particular becomes demonized. I mean, quite literally, they see a strong associations between women and the devil, sometimes embodied also by the figure of the witch. And that connection is visually spelled out by hair, especially loose, untamed, unordered, uncombed hair becomes this potent demonic force the men simply cannot resist. It's just something out of control. And that's why there's so much attention to ordering, compacting it, hiding it. Because at the end, these people are not so much talking about hair. They're talking about all these kind of forces that escapes their control. So that's where hair becomes really a metaphor for anything that escapes people's control.
And what I really appreciated in the way you looked at this was that the women who are taking care of their hair are getting it coming and going, in that they are told they have to keep their hair under control. They need to put all this work into it to make sure that it is covered, it's tight, it's out of the way. But then it's also dismissed as so frivolous. Why would you even spend your time on it? So it's like women are supposed to spend their time on it, and then they're in trouble for spending their time on it, which is, very typical of the Middle Ages and, well, all sorts of periods of history. But also, I was really appreciative that you pulled that out of that, because it is something that is very typical of misogynist tracts from all through history.
Precisely. It's this vicious circle where a person is told to be wrong, and the corrective proves that this person is wrong. So there's just like no way out of it. It's fascinating. It's fascinating to read. It's also terrifying to read how perfectly circular this reasoning is, which means there was impossible to escape. I mean, women in medical text are defined as creatures with long hair. The hair is the differential. The long hair is the differential. And at the same time, they cannot cut it, because to cut it would mean to go against their own nature. And so they're forced to comb it and spend hours because they cannot cut it. So they still have the baby hair by the time they're 20. And they spend 8 hours to dry it when the sun is out. And then because of that, they said, oh, these people are frivolous and they don't do anything important to society. So they're really trapped, in this prison of hair, and they cannot get out of it. Hair becomes one of their main occupations, and also, again, the main differential. And really, it's fascinating from a logical perspective. It's absolutely terrifying from a human perspective. And the book is trying to understand how we can get out of this still today. Today, what can we do in order not to reduce women to this prison of hair?
Yes, I mean, it's the same with all sorts of women's things as well, where we know from scientific research that women who wear makeup are treated better. They get more raises, they get treated better just in general, but then they get criticized for wearing makeup to begin with.
Right.
So it's the same sort of circular logic. And so having this sort of pulled out, teased out in your book was very gratifying, but important, because you get to see, first of all, how long this is happening, and it's going on for even longer than this book is concerned with. But the fact that it's there and you can read it in the text and you can see that circle is important to point out.
Yeah, and I think the part is particularly difficult is that it's not just the woman that is singled out as the victim of the circular reasoning, but it's the whole world. In fact, the woman and the way a woman is concerned with her hair is an example of this circular reasoning that affects the whole world. For instance, one of the points I make in the book is that women are supposed to treat their hair with what in the Middle Ages was basically considered a fertilizer. They have basically to boil ash in water for hours. It's a medicament that's called ranno in Florentine. But this liquid is literally the same one that is used to fertilize fruit trees like pomegranate and so on. And then you realize that, combing the hair was often described as raking the ground, and that the woman is sometimes considered to be like Mother Earth. And so the woman is more vegetative than a man because she's constantly compared to actual vegetation and hair care to agriculture. And therefore, it's like, so it's not just enough to say the women's are not just a hair. You have basically to take down and deconstruct also agriculture and how nature works as a whole, and many other things. For instance, how love poetry is constructed and language. And then that's where desperation kind of comes in. It was like, there's just no way out. No surprise that this way of thinking went on for centuries. Because everything fits together so closely in such a seamless way that it's just kind of impossible to attack. And in fact, it's only through centuries when people debunk that humoral theory, but we're already in the 17th century, when women fight for all sorts of rights. And when agriculture started shifting, when Copernicus entered into the picture, all these elements make this whole circular reasoning more fragile, and eventually it shatters. But it takes so much effort from so many parts, because again, hair and women are not isolated. They're just part of this kind of larger conceptions of the world. And in a certain way, an historian needs to address that as well.
It's true. I'm trying to think of what is a good follow-up question to this, because we have now covered the entire world
and the universe.
It's true, though. It's true. Okay, then let's end on a note that's a little bit sillier. When you were looking through hair care, what was the strangest thing that you found in terms of what people did to their hair? Do you think the fertilizer was the strangest thing that people did to their heads?
I mean, the fertilizer was pretty strange. I must admit it. They did so many strange things. A couple of the strangest things I found were garlands were the sunglasses of the Renaissance. That I thought was cute. No, I think no one says that in the literature, but I found passages in the literature, in the sources that say, I'm putting my garland on so that I can see even in sunlight. So, that's basically sunglasses. So that was pretty strange. The other one was like that women went in the streets to get their hair combed. I mean, if you have a maid, if you're an aristocrat, if you have money, you do everything in your bedchamber. But most women actually went to the streets. So the hairstylist will be on the streets together with some other mendicant and beggars and other artisans. But, they wouldn't go to the hair salon as we do today. So these are perhaps two of the weirdest things I found together, definitely with the fertilizer.
There are so many interesting hair remedies from places like the Trotula. They're so interesting. The fertilizer one is a good one, I have to say. And then finally, if you'd like someone to have a good conception of how hair is playing out in the tension of the time, do you think Botticelli's Venus is where we should be sending people?
Yes, I think Botticelli's Venus is a great starting point, mostly because the painting is so well known. But in the book, I return multiple times to another painting by Sandro Botticelli that is a portrait of an unknown woman that we think is a portrait of Simonetta Vespucci, the most beautiful woman in Florence at the time. The painting is today in Frankfurt at the Städel Museum. And I find that painting so interesting because it depicts the profile of a beautiful woman with the most incredible hairstyle you've ever seen. It's literally like a labyrinth. And the painting for me exemplifies many of the strands that I care about in this book because it shows the results of never-ending sessions of hairstyle. At the same time, this woman was herself an object of violence. She said that she was so beautiful that every man was free to fall in love with her, even if she didn't even look at them. almost as if, she doesn't even have to speak because, she has literally zero will. And the painting, it's interesting because on the sides it's got this hair that I describe as flaming. And because this is a painting that's telling you what a man should feel when looking at this woman, should see the flames of passions having entered his eyes. And so that's also, a sort of double form of violence. The man is considered to be a victim of desire, but at the same time, the woman is there just like as a silent object being looked at, and it has zero agency. And then I explain also how, if you're looking from another angle, the painting is also a pushback against all the sermons that criticize women for donning this beautiful hairstyle. So that, in a sort of way, is the core painting of the book. But it's not well known. It's only known among art historians. But perhaps, reading the book is an occasion to also experience this extraordinary painting.
That's an excellent answer. And hopefully we'll be able to find a link to it so we can show people what this painting looks like, as well as Botticelli's Venus. Thank you so much for coming on and talking to us about hair, because I think it's a subject that may seem simple at the outset. And this was the same thing I said to you about measurement when you came on the last time. Seems simple, but there are so many societal, cultural, complex ideas that have to do with it. So thank you so much for coming on and telling us all about it.
Thank you so much, Danielle, for having me. And thank you for your kind words about the book.
To find out more about Emanuele's work, you can visit his faculty page at Stanford University. His new book is Knots, or the Violence of Desire in Renaissance Florence. Before we go, here's Peter from medievalist.net to tell us what's on the website. What's going on, Peter?
Hey. Well, we have this recent research about Viking women who were in Gotland, and they had elongated heads.
What?
So there was 3 women that were discovered at various places on Gotland. They all lived in the kind of late 11th century, and their skulls had been reshapen, probably right just after birth, right? So it made them have that kind of a long, little alien-like. So the piece kind of takes a look at who these women were, and one of them seems to have been fairly well off, just with what she was buried with. And there's a lot of questions on, did this happen in Gotland? Did this happen somewhere else, say Bulgaria? And these women came from there? Were they looked at as outsiders? Were they looked at as kind of special women in Viking culture? So really kind of fascinating stuff on that about body modification among the Vikings.
Wow, that sounds like a really good story. It's not ancient aliens, right? That's not the answer. Come on, that was an easy one.
I'm not saying it's ancient aliens.
But you're not saying it. Yes, you're definitely not saying that. All right, what else have you got for us on the website?
So we also have this piece about why ostrich eggs can be found in medieval churches.
Nice.
And again, we're doing some odd stuff here on medievalist.net. So, but yeah, I was really shocked. You can see places, ostrich eggs hanging from the ceilings at medieval churches, and there's a whole bunch of reasons why.
Wow.
So we have that. Plus, Nicholas Morton, he's preparing a new online course for us, and he's written a couple of articles related to like the Crusades, including how to defeat Crusader knights.
Ooh.
If you're liking his stuff about like Mamluks, Mongols, Crusaders, he has some articles for that, and we also have a course just coming up on that as well.
Perfect. And if people want to test it out, they can listen to my interview with him on the podcast about his book, The Mongol Storm. So
exactly.
Nice. Well, thank you, Peter, for stopping by and telling us what's on the website.
Thanks.
Thank you to everyone who supports my work and that of other indie historians through medievalist.net's Patreon page. Patrons have access to all sorts of awesome stuff like subscriptions to Medieval World magazine, a book club, digital downloads, and ad-free versions of medievalist.net and this podcast. To get in on all the action and to support your favorite medievalists, please visit patreon.com/medievalists. For everything from hair to fairs, follow medievalist.net on Facebook or X at Medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Cybulskie, across social media at 5MIN Medievalist or 5 Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores, where you can get hold of Chivalry and Courtesy, Medieval Manners for a Modern World, now out in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Guy Frog. Thanks for listening, and have yourself an amazing day.